He thought I would cry. He thought I would beg. He thought I would sign anything just to make the pain stop. He was wrong about all of it.
My name is Elaine Harper, and for 17 years, I was a wife. Not a trophy wife, not a partner wife. I was the kind of wife who remembered to buy his mother's birthday gift, who kept the house running while he chased promotions, who smiled at his colleagues during dinner parties even when I was exhausted. I was the foundation, and foundations, as I learned, are the first thing people forget are there. Let me tell you exactly how it happened, because the details matter. The details always matter. It was a Tuesday evening. Rain was falling against the living room window, the kind of rain that makes you want to stay inside. But I wasn't hiding. I was sitting at the dining table, reading a book I had been trying to finish for 3 months. I heard his footsteps on the stairs, slow, deliberate, not the sound of a man coming home, the sound of a man preparing. He walked into the room and didn't look at me. Not at first. He set a folder on the table, a thin one, the kind that holds documents, not feelings. Then he sat down across from me and said 5 words that changed everything. We need to talk. I closed my book. I had learned over 17 years that when a man says we need to talk, he doesn't mean we. He means you need to listen. So I listened. He said he wasn't happy. He said he hadn't been happy for a long time. He said he felt like he was carrying me, like I was weight. Baggage. That word. Baggage. I looked at him, really looked at him. And for the first time in 17 years, I didn't see my husband. I saw a man who had already left. He was just waiting for me to notice. He slid the papers across the table. Divorce papers, no anger. Well, no hesitation, no apology, just a pen and a look on his face that said he had already moved on. What he didn't know was that I had already seen this coming, and I had already made my move. I picked up the pen. I didn't sign, I just held it. And I said, I'll read it first. And he said, it's standard. I said, I'm sure it is. And I put the papers in my bag. That was the first time he looked at me like he didn't recognize me. Good, because the version of me he was used to, the one who nodded and trusted and believed, she was already gone. Let me tell you something about control. It doesn't arrive with a bang. It arrives with a whisper, with small conveniences that slowly become dependencies. Richard handled the finances, not because I couldn't, but because it made things easier. That's what he always said, and at the time it did. I was working too, consulting, flexible contracts, good money. But somewhere along the way, I stopped paying attention to the details because I trusted him, because we were a team, or at least I thought we were. It started small. I've already taken care of it. Don't worry about that. I'll handle it. And one day I woke up and realized I didn't actually know how my own life was structured anymore. The first time something felt off wasn't emotional. It was financial. I was reviewing our joint account, something I hadn't done in months, and I noticed a transfer. Not large enough to panic over, but consistent, quiet, deliberate. The same amount, the same date, every month. So I asked him about it, casually, over coffee. Richard, who is Harper Legal Holdings? He didn't flinch. He didn't even turn around. He just said, "The old corporate shell, dissolved years ago. Don't worry about it." And he changed the subject. That was the moment, not the affair, not the divorce, that moment. Because after 17 years, you learn the difference between truth and a well-practiced answer. I didn't confront him again. I didn't argue. I didn't accuse. I paid attention. I started reviewing statements, old accounts, tax filings. What I found wasn't random. It was structured. Money moved in patterns. Accounts I didn't recognize. Decisions I was never included in. He hadn't just been making choices. He had been preparing. That's the thing about betrayal at this stage in life. It doesn't explode. It settles quietly and forces you to ask one question. How long has this been happening? And the answer is never comforting. I didn't cry, honey, because something else had already taken its place. Clarity. Richard thought I wasn't paying attention. What he didn't understand was that before I became his wife, I had built a career out of reading people who thought they were smarter than everyone else in the room. And Richard had just made one mistake. He got comfortable with the version of me that stopped asking questions. So when he finally sat across from me, slid those divorce papers forward, and told me he wanted out, I didn't react. I didn't argue. I didn't ask why. I just looked at him, picked up the pen, and smiled. Because by then, I already knew exactly how this was going to end. The strange thing about clarity is that once you have it, you cannot unsee anything. After that conversation, after the papers were placed in front of me like a transaction, I did not fall apart. I started observing. Richard moved differently after that night, lighter, more relaxed, like a man who believed the hardest part was already over. And in his mind, it probably was, because he assumed I would react the way I always had, quiet, emotional, unprepared. He was counting on confusion. What he didn't expect was precision. The next morning, he left the house early, earlier than usual. No explanation, no routine conversation, just a quick, "I'll be late tonight." 17 years of marriage teaches you patterns, and that wasn't one of them. So I did something I hadn't done in years. I followed the pattern, not the man. I went straight to the study, closed the door, and opened his laptop. Richard was not careless. He was organized, disciplined. The kind of man who believed structure was the same thing as security. But structure leaves trails, emails, archived folders, financial summaries, everything categorized, everything intentional. At first glance, nothing looked wrong, which is exactly what made it wrong. Because real life, messy, shared, unpredictable life, does not look that clean. So I stopped looking for obvious answers and started looking for repetition. Transfers, monthly, same date, same amount. Always just under the threshold that would trigger attention. Different account, different name, but consistent, too consistent. I wrote it down, did not screenshot, did not email it, just wrote it down the way I used to when details mattered, because they did. Then I checked older records, 3 years back, then 5, and there it was, the same pattern. It was smaller amounts at first, then gradually increasing, not reckless, not impulsive, planned. This wasn't a mistake. This was a strategy. I leaned back in the chair and asked myself the only question that mattered now. Who is he building this for? Because men like Richard don't move money without purpose. And that's when something else clicked. It wasn't just the money, it was the distance, the late calls, the quiet texts, the way he had stopped reacting to anything I said months ago. Not irritation, not frustration, nothing. That kind of detachment doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from replacement. But here's the thing most people get wrong. The affair isn't the betrayal. It's the decision that comes before it. The moment they start planning a life that doesn't include you while still living inside yours. That's the betrayal. Awam and Richard? He had been planning for a long time. I didn't need to search his phone. I didn't need to follow him. The numbers told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't emotional. It was logistical. He was preparing to leave with structure, with resources, with control, and most importantly, without resistance. Me. I stood up slowly, walked to the window, and for the first time since he handed me those papers, I allowed myself to feel it. Not heartbreak, not even anger, disrespect. 17 years, reduced to a plan I wasn't supposed to notice. That's when I understood something clearly. Richard didn't think I was weak. He thought I was irrelevant, and that kind of mistake is expensive. I went back to the desk, closed the laptop, and sat there for a moment, thinking, not reacting. Because reacting would mean playing the role he had already written for me, and I wasn't interested in that anymore. If he wanted a clean exit, organized, controlled, predictable, then I would give him exactly that, just not in the way he expected. That afternoon, I made my first call, not to a friend, not to family, to someone I hadn't spoken to in years, a forensic accountant. His name was Martin Blake. And if there was one thing he was known for, it was finding what people thought was invisible. I didn't explain everything. I didn't need to. I just said one sentence. I think my husband has been moving money for years, and I need to know where it's going. There was a pause on the line. Short, professional. Then he said, "All right, let's take a look." And just like that, this stopped being a divorce. It became an investigation. That night, Richard came home late, just like he said he would. Calm, unbothered, certain. He asked what I had decided. I looked at him, really looked at him this time, and realized something that would have broken me a year ago. I didn't recognize him anymore, and more importantly, I didn't need to. "I'll sign," I said quietly. Relief, immediate, visible. He nodded, like everything was going according to plan. And I let him believe that, because for the first time in a long time it was, just not his plan. 2 days after I contacted Martin Blake, I stopped trying to act normal, because normal was no longer useful to me. Richard, on the other hand, was becoming more relaxed by the day. He had that look again, the one men get when they believe the outcome is already decided. He even started being polite, strangely polite. Not as if kindness could soften what he had already set in motion, but I wasn't looking at his behavior anymore. I was waiting for evidence, and Martin didn't disappoint. He called me on a Tuesday morning. No small talk, no delay, just facts. "Elaine," he said, "I need you to sit down for this." And I did, because something in his voice told me this wasn't speculation anymore. "It's worse than you thought," he continued. "There are multiple accounts, offshore structures, and layered transfers." I stayed quiet, not because I was calm, because I was processing. Then he said the part that changed everything. "And there's a pattern of recurring transfers tied to one individual." A pause, then, "A woman." There it was, not shocking, not surprising, just confirmation. I closed my eyes for a moment, not out of pain, out of clarity, because deep down, I already knew. It wasn't the money alone, it never is. It's where the money goes that tells the truth. Martin continued, "They've been careful, very careful, but not perfect." And then he sent me the report. I opened it slowly, line by line, account by account, transfer by transfer. And there she was, repeated, consistent, undeniable. A woman named Claire Donovan, not just a name, a pattern, a destination, a second life funded quietly from mine. And suddenly everything made sense. The late nights, the emotional distance, the detachment that felt like indifference. It wasn't indifference, it was allocation. I wasn't being ignored. I was being phased out. But here's what Richard miscalculated. He thought secrecy meant control. What it actually meant was delay. Because once you see the structure, you can reverse it. I printed everything, every report, every transfer, every trace, not because I was emotional, but because paper doesn't forget. Then I called Martin again. "This is enough for legal action?" I asked. A pause, then, "Yes, and more importantly, it's enough to protect you." That was the first time I realized this wasn't just about uncovering betrayal. It was about positioning. Richard thought divorce was an ending, but legally it's a process, a sequence, a system, and systems can be navigated or controlled. I chose controlled. Martin outlined the next steps carefully. Freeze reviews, asset tracing, preliminary filings, nothing aggressive, nothing visible, just structure, quiet structure, the kind Richard always trusted. Meanwhile, at home, he had no idea. He still came in late. We still checked his phone in another room, still lived like a man already free. But something had shifted, even if he couldn't see it, because now I was no longer reacting to him. I was documenting him. One evening, he sat across from me at dinner, casual, comfortable, like nothing had changed. "You've been quiet lately," he said. I looked at him, really looked at him, and realized how easy it would have been to waste years trying to be heard by someone like that. "I've just been thinking," I said calmly. "About us?" he asked. A dangerous question, not because of the answer, because of what he assumed the answer would be. But I didn't give him truth. Not yet. "I think we're already past that stage," I said. He nodded slightly, almost relieved, and that told me everything I needed to know. He wasn't afraid of losing me. Well, he was afraid of managing fallout. There's a difference, a very important one. That night, after he went to bed, I sat alone in the living room. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that used to feel like peace. Now it felt like preparation. I opened my laptop, reviewed everything again, not because I doubted it, because understanding power requires repetition. Every transfer, every account, every connection. And for the first time, I didn't feel like the victim in the story. I felt like the person reading the blueprint. Richard had built a structure to exit my life cleanly, but he had made one assumption, that I wouldn't understand it, or worse, that I wouldn't use it. I closed the laptop slowly and made a decision. Not emotional, not reactive, strategic. If Richard wanted a divorce, I would give him one, but not the version he prepared for, not the version he controlled, the version that reflected reality. And once reality enters the courtroom, control doesn't belong to the loudest person. It belongs to the most prepared. There's a moment in every quiet war when one side starts to feel it even before they see it. Richard didn't notice the paperwork first, or the accounts, or the legal positioning. He noticed the silence. Not my silence. His. The kind that comes when things stop responding the way you expect them to. It started small. A call he made that wasn't returned immediately. A request from his lawyer that felt delayed. A financial confirmation that took longer than usual. Nothing obvious. Nothing dramatic. Just friction. And Richard wasn't used to friction. Not in his life. Not in his decisions. Not in his control. And that was the first crack. Meanwhile, I continued exactly as planned. Calm, present, predictable. The version of me he thought he understood. At home, nothing changed on the surface. We still spoke when necessary, still shared space, still maintained appearances. But underneath it all, the structure had already shifted. Martin had moved the filings forward quietly. Not aggressive, not visible, just precise. And precision, in legal terms, is more powerful than force. Richard received the first notice on a Thursday afternoon. Not a dramatic confrontation, not a courtroom summons, just a formal request for financial disclosure as part of divorce proceedings. He called me immediately. His voice wasn't angry. Not yet. It was confused. "Elaine, what is this?" he asked. I paused before answering. "Marie, because tone matters more than words in moments like this." "I think it's standard," I said calmly. "Martin said it's just part of the process." Silence. That silence lasted longer than I expected. Not because he didn't understand, but because he did. For the first time, something was outside his control. "This wasn't discussed," he said. "No," I replied gently. "It wasn't." And that was the moment it landed. Because men like Richard don't fear divorce. They fear disorder. And this was becoming disorderly. Over the next few days, his behavior changed. Subtly at first, then noticeably. More questions, more checking, more tension disguised as routine conversation. But I stayed consistent, measured, unshaken. Because panic is loud, and I had no reason to be loud. The truth was already in motion. One evening, he came home earlier than usual, didn't announce it, just appeared, standing in the kitchen like he was trying to re-enter a space that no longer felt familiar. "You've been talking to lawyers," he said. Not a question, an observation. "Yes," I replied, a pause. "Why?" I looked at him, and for the first time, I didn't soften my answer. "Because I deserve to understand what's happening to my life." His jaw tightened slightly. Not anger, control slipping. "That's not how I intended this to go," he said quietly. And there it was. Intended. As if divorce was a plan he expected me to simply follow. I nodded slowly. "I understand." But I didn't agree. That night after he went to bed, I sat in the living room longer than usual. Not anxious, not emotional, just aware. Because something had changed. He wasn't confident anymore. He was monitoring, adjusting, calculating, which meant one thing. He finally understood I was no longer passive in this process. The next morning, Martin called again. "We've traced more," he said, "and you need to see this." I opened my laptop, and what I saw confirmed everything. Another layer, another structure, another set of financial movements connected to the same pattern. But this time, it wasn't just about money. It was timing. The transfers aligned perfectly with the period he began talking about divorce, which meant this wasn't just betrayal, it was preparation. He had been building his exit long before he announced it, and I had been placed exactly where he needed me to be. Quiet, unaware, predictable, but that version of me no longer existed. I closed the laptop slowly, and for the first time, I felt something shift completely. Not sadness, not anger, direction. Because now I wasn't reacting to a broken marriage. I was standing inside a structured plan, and structured plans can be rewritten. Control is a strange thing. You don't always realize when you've lost it. You just start feeling it slipping in small, inconvenient ways. That's exactly what started happening to Richard. At first it was subtle. His lawyer needed more time. Certain documents weren't readily available. Financial confirmations were being reviewed more carefully than expected. Nothing was denied. Nothing was refused, just delayed. And for a man like Richard, delay felt like disrespect. But what he didn't understand was that nothing was being delayed randomly. Everything was being processed correctly, thoroughly, legally. And the difference between control and compliance is often paperwork. Meanwhile, I remained steady, present in the house, calm in conversation, consistent in tone. The version of me he underestimated was the version I continued to perform. Because people reveal more when they believe the script hasn't changed, and Richard was still acting like he was directing it. One evening he came home later than usual again, tired, irritated, quietly unsettled. He didn't say hello at first, just loosened his tie and stood in the doorway like he was trying to recalibrate something in his mind. "You're making this more complicated than it needs to be," he said finally, not angry, frustrated. I looked up from my tea. "I'm following legal advice," I replied calmly. He exhaled sharply. "That's not what this is supposed to look like." That word again. Supposed. As if my response had to match his expectation to be valid. I set the cup down gently. "Richard, this stopped being about expectations a while ago." A pause, his eyes narrowed slightly. Then he said something quieter, more revealing. "You're not acting like yourself." I almost smiled, because that was the first honest thing he had said in days. "No," I replied. "I'm not acting like the version of myself you were comfortable with." Silence. And in that silence, something shifted between us. Not loudly, not visibly, but permanently. The next morning, Martin called again. His tone was different, more certain. "We've completed the preliminary tracing," he said. "And Elaine, You need to understand something. I sat down immediately. This isn't just asset movement, he continued. It's structured separation planning. He's been organizing this for over a year. I closed my eyes briefly, not in shock, in confirmation, because deep down, I already knew the timeline was longer than he admitted. Martin continued, and there's something else. That line alone changed the air in the room. The accounts linked to Claire Donovan are not just personal transfers. They're tied to shared business exposure. I opened my eyes slowly. Meaning? Meaning, he said carefully, he didn't just prepare to leave you. He prepared to isolate you financially while protecting himself. There it was, the real structure, not just betrayal, architecture, and suddenly everything made sense in a colder way. The politeness, the patience, the divorce timing. It wasn't emotional, it was engineered. That afternoon, I did something different. I didn't sit in silence. I didn't observe. I acted. I called Martin back and said one sentence. Start preparing full protection filing. He didn't ask questions. He just said, understood. Because now the shift was official. This was no longer about discovery. It was about positioning. That evening, Richard noticed something different. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I didn't adjust. I simply agreed when necessary and stayed silent when not. And silence, when used correctly, feels like distance. He noticed it. Of course he did. You're distant again, he said at dinner. I looked at him calmly. I'm focused, I replied. Another pause. On something else, he asked. I held his gaze for a moment longer than usual. Yes, I said, and I let it sit there. No explanation, no clarification, just truth delivered in its most uncomfortable form. And that night, after he went to bed, I sat alone in the living room again. But this time, I wasn't reviewing fear. I was reviewing structure. Everything Martin had uncovered. Every account, every pattern, every connection. And for the first time, I didn't feel like someone responding to betrayal. I felt like someone organizing the end of it, because Richard had built his exit carefully. But he had made one assumption, that I would remain unchanged while he prepared to leave. And that assumption was already collapsing. There's a point in every carefully built plan where confidence starts to feel like pressure. Not because anything has gone wrong, but because things are no longer going exactly as expected. That was beginning to happen to Richard, quietly, uncomfortably. On the surface, nothing had collapsed. No dramatic confrontation, and no public exposure, no obvious loss of control. But beneath that surface, the structure was tightening. His lawyer had started asking more precise questions. Not aggressive ones, just specific. Too specific to ignore. Documentation that once felt routine now required explanation, and explanations require time. Time Richard hadn't planned for. Meanwhile, I remained steady, predictable, almost unchanged, and that in itself was starting to unsettle him. One evening he came home earlier than usual again. He didn't announce himself this time, just walked in quietly like he was trying to observe the house before it observed him. You've escalated things, he said without greeting. I looked up from my seat, calm. What do you mean? He hesitated, not because he didn't know, because he was choosing how to frame it. Shauna, your lawyer's being aggressive. I almost smiled at that word, aggressive. No, I said gently. He's being thorough. Silence. That word again. Thorough. Richard exhaled slowly. This isn't how this was supposed to go. There it was again. Supposed. I stood up slowly and walked toward the counter, not to distance myself, but to steady the conversation. Richard, I said, what exactly did you think was going to happen? He didn't answer immediately, and that pause told me everything. Because men like Richard don't plan outcomes. They plan assumptions. I thought we would handle this like adults, he finally said. I nodded slightly. We are. Another silence, but this one felt heavier, because beneath it was something new. Uncertainty. The next morning, Martin called again. His voice was lower than usual, focused. "Yeah, we've identified additional structural links," he said. I didn't ask for clarification. I already knew this wasn't simple anymore. He continued, "This isn't just separation planning now. It's layered protection strategy. Meaning, meaning he's not just trying to exit," Martin said carefully. "He's trying to isolate exposure." That phrase landed differently. Isolate exposure. Not escape, not leave. Control fallout. I leaned back slowly in my chair, because now it wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was risk management, and I was part of that risk. Martin continued, "There is also movement tied to Claire Donovan that's becoming more active. That name again, not emotional, not dramatic, just functional." "What kind of movement?" I asked. "Operational," he said. "Not personal transfers anymore. Structured allocation." And just like that, the illusion cracked further. This wasn't a side relationship. This was part of the system. A system Richard believed was stable, controlled, protected. But systems built in secrecy always depend on one thing, that no one looks closely enough. And I had already looked. That evening, Richard didn't speak much at dinner. He kept checking his phone. Not casually, not habitually, carefully, like someone waiting for a message that might confirm or disrupt something important. "You're distracted," I said calmly. He looked up quickly. "I'm busy." A pause. "With what?" I asked. Another hesitation. Shorter this time. "Work," he said, but it wasn't convincing anymore. Not even to him. After dinner, he went straight to the study, closed the door, not loudly, not angrily, deliberately. And for the first time, I didn't wonder what he was doing, because I already knew. He was trying to regain control of something that had already moved beyond him. Later that night, Martin sent one final message. Short, direct. "We're close." I stared at those words for a long moment. Not excitement, not fear, readiness, because now everything was converging. The structure Richard built, the version of me he underestimated, the system he thought would protect him. All of it was reaching the same point. And the truth about convergence is simple. Something always gives way first. Control doesn't collapse all at once. It slips. Then it stutters. Then it starts to fail in places you didn't expect. For Richard, that moment arrived on a Tuesday morning. Not in the courtroom, not in a confrontation, but in an email. Wanting a simple notification from his legal team requesting clarification on previously undisclosed financial structures. He read it once, then again, slower the second time, because now it wasn't vague anymore. It was targeted, and Richard understood something very quickly. Someone else had already done the work. Meanwhile, I was no longer waiting for updates. I was operating inside them. Martin had shifted everything into motion quietly. No drama, no noise, just precision. And precision, when executed correctly, feels invisible until it becomes unavoidable. That evening, Richard came home different. Not louder, not angrier. Worse, controlled panic disguised as calm. He didn't greet me immediately. He stood in the hallway longer than usual, like he was recalibrating the house before stepping into it. Finally, he spoke. "Elaine, have you been discussing more than you told me?" I looked at him, calm, measured. "I've been following legal advice," he said. He nodded slowly, but it wasn't acceptance. It was calculation, because now he was trying to map what I knew, and more importantly, what I didn't say. "You're escalating this," he said carefully. I tilted my head slightly. "I'm protecting myself." A pause, longer this time. "That's not necessary," he replied, almost too quickly. And there it was, the slip. Because unnecessary protection is only unnecessary when you assume nothing is being threatened. I didn't respond immediately. I let the silence settle. Then I said quietly, "Then you shouldn't be worried." That line landed harder than expected, not because it was aggressive, but because it was calm. Richard exhaled slowly and looked away. Hey, for the first time, he didn't have an immediate answer, and that absence of response was new. The next morning, Martin called again. His tone was steady but sharper. "We've confirmed something important," he said. I stayed silent, waiting. "Claire Donovan is no longer just a recipient of funds. She is now legally connected to one of the offshore structures." That changed everything. Not emotionally, structurally, because now she wasn't a side detail. She was part of the framework, meaning Richard's separation plan was no longer isolated. It was exposed to alignment risk. I leaned forward slowly. "So what does that mean?" I asked. Martin didn't hesitate. "It means if we proceed correctly, the structure can't protect him the way he intended." Silence. That wasn't collapse, but it was vulnerability. And vulnerability is where control starts to shift. That evening, Richard tried something different. He came into the living room early, sat down opposite me. No phone, no distractions, direct. "We need to slow this down," he said. I looked at him calmly. "Slow it down." "This process," he replied. Another pause. "This isn't going in a direction I expected." And there it was. Honesty. Finally. Not truth, but acknowledgement. I nodded slightly. "I think that's clear." He leaned forward. "You're not supposed to be this prepared." A faint smile crossed my face. Not mocking, just understanding. "Richard," I said softly, "I didn't become prepared after you filed for divorce." Silence. "I became prepared after I realized I wasn't being included in my own life." That line changed the room. Not loudly, but permanently. And for the first time, he didn't interrupt, didn't correct, didn't redirect. He just listened. And listening, for someone like Richard, meant he was no longer in control of the narrative. Later that night, Martin sent another update, short, direct. "We're entering critical phase." I read it twice, then closed the laptop. Not because I was overwhelmed, but because there was nothing left to analyze. Only timing. And timing, once it reaches its final stage, doesn't wait for permission. Richard thought divorce was a process he initiated, a structured exit, a clean transition. But what he failed to understand was that processes evolve, and this one had already left his control. There's a point in every control system where pressure stops being invisible and starts becoming measurable. For Richard, that point didn't arrive with drama. It arrived with confirmation, a formal notice. Not from me, not from emotion, from structure. His legal team had received a compliance escalation request linked to the offshore disclosures Martin's team had traced, and this time, there was no ambiguity. They were asking for full verification of financial movements tied to shared exposure, meaning the system was no longer neutral. It was now reactive. Richard read it standing up, then sat down without realizing it, because for the first time he didn't recognize the shape of what was happening. Meanwhile, I didn't move differently. I didn't celebrate. I didn't react, because reaction implies surprise, and I wasn't surprised anymore. I was aligned. Martin called shortly after. His voice was steady but deliberate. "Anna, we've reached the stage where everything must be documented in sequence," he said. I understood immediately. Audit readiness, legal structuring, full trace validation. This was no longer about discovery. It was about exposure control. "Does this increase risk for him?" I asked calmly. A pause, then, "Yes, if he responds incorrectly." That was enough. Not danger, not collapse, but consequence sensitivity. That evening, Richard came home later than usual. He didn't try to appear calm this time. He was already past that stage. When he walked in, he didn't sit. He stood in the kitchen, hands on the counter, breathing controlled but tight. "You've changed the nature of this," he said. I looked up from my seat, calm. "I followed legal advice," I repeated. He shook his head slightly. "Heine, that's not what this was supposed to become." And there it was again. Supposed. As if outcomes were meant to obey expectation. I set my glass down gently. "Richard, you keep saying that." He looked at me sharply. "But what you mean is this isn't going in a way that benefits you anymore." Silence. This time, he didn't deny it immediately. That hesitation told me everything. Because denial is easy when control feels intact. But when control weakens, people pause before speaking truthfully. The next morning, Martin sent a new update, shorter than usual. "We've established legal linkage risk through Claire Donovan." I read it twice, then leaned back. "So it's confirmed?" I asked. "Yes," he replied, "and it changes how his structure can be defended." Meaning? Meaning she is no longer just external to the case, as she is now part of its vulnerability. That word again, vulnerability, not emotional, strategic. And now Richard had two problems, not one. That afternoon, something changed at home, subtle but noticeable. Richard started checking his phone more frequently, not casually, not habitually, carefully. Like every notification carried weight. And for the first time, he didn't stay in the same room as me for long. Distance had shifted direction. He wasn't distancing me anymore. He was distancing himself from the situation. That evening, he tried to reassert control, gently at first. "We should resolve this privately," he said. I looked at him calmly. "We are resolving it legally." A pause. "I mean without escalation," he clarified. I nodded slightly. "I understand what you mean." But I didn't agree. One, and that distinction mattered more than he realized, because agreement would have meant returning to the version of the dynamic he recognized. And that version no longer existed. Later that night, after he went to bed early, I sat alone in the living room, not thinking, not reacting, just observing the final alignment. Everything Martin had built, everything Richard had assumed, everything I had quietly repositioned. It was all converging now, and convergence always removes illusions. Martin's final message of the night came through. Simple. "Next stage will require your confirmation." I didn't respond immediately, because confirmation isn't just agreement, it's commitment. And once you commit to truth at this level, there is no returning to ignorance. I closed my eyes briefly. Then I replied, "Yeah, proceed." There's a moment in every long, carefully built collapse where everything stops being theoretical and becomes real. For Richard, that moment came quietly. No warning, no confrontation, no dramatic scene, just a formal legal activation notice, filed, processed, confirmed. And suddenly, the divorce was no longer an idea. It was a live case. Richard read the notice twice, then a third time. Not because he didn't understand it, but because he did. This wasn't the version he had planned for. Not even close. Meanwhile, I didn't feel urgency. I felt completion of structure. Martin called shortly after the filing confirmation went through. His voice was steady, controlled. "It's officially active now," he said. I nodded even though he couldn't see me. "What? I understand." "There's no reversing at this stage without full mutual agreement," he continued. Silence followed, meaning the system had locked, not in hostility, in process. That distinction mattered, because process is harder to escape than conflict. That evening, Richard came home earlier than expected. Different energy this time. Not frustration, not confusion. Something more uncomfortable. Awareness. He didn't sit immediately. He stood in the hallway longer than usual, like the house itself had changed tone. Then he spoke. "This has gone too far." I looked at him calmly. "It's gone exactly as far as the law allows." A pause. His jaw tightened slightly. You involved outsiders in something that should have stayed between us. I set my book down slowly. Richard, you involved structure before I ever did. Silence. When because that was the truth neither of us could avoid anymore. He exhaled slowly and sat down. Not relaxed, not composed, just lowered. For the first time, he didn't look like someone managing a situation. He looked like someone inside it. You don't understand what this is doing, he said quietly. I studied him for a moment, then replied gently, I understand more than you think. That answer unsettled him more than anger would have. Because anger is predictable, clarity is not. The next morning, Martin sent the next update. Short, direct. Full disclosure phase initiated. I read it twice, then closed the message, because now there was no ambiguity left. Everything would surface. Everything structured would be examined. Everything hidden would become visible, and systems like Richard's only survive in partial visibility. When that afternoon, something shifted at home again, but this time, it wasn't subtle. Richard received a call. I didn't hear the conversation, but I saw his face change, not dramatically, gradually, like realization spreading too fast to control. When he ended the call, he didn't move immediately. He just stood there, staring at nothing. Then he looked at me, for a moment longer than usual. You knew, he said quietly, not a question, an acknowledgement. I met his gaze calmly. I paid attention, I replied. That was all, and that was enough, because attention is more powerful than accusation. It doesn't argue. It doesn't shout. It simply observes until truth becomes unavoidable. That night, Richard didn't go to the study. He didn't check his phone as often. He didn't speak much. He just sat, quiet, still. And for the first time since this began, he wasn't planning anymore. He was absorbing. The next morning, Martin called again, but this time his voice was different, slightly elevated, not alarmed, but definitive. We've reached full structural exposure threshold, he said. I understood immediately. Everything that could be uncovered had been mapped. Meaning? I asked calmly. Meaning, he replied, there's nowhere left for the system to hide. Silence, not collapse, not resolution, exposure. And exposure changes everything. That evening, Richard sat across from me again. But this time, he didn't speak immediately. When he finally did, his voice was lower, less controlled. I didn't think it would reach this point. I nodded slightly. I know. A pause, and then, for the first time, he didn't try to justify it. Because justification requires control, and control was no longer fully his. I stood up slowly, not dramatically, just naturally. Richard, I said softly, I think you underestimated how long I've been preparing for clarity. He didn't respond, because there was nothing left in him to argue against it. And in that silence, the final stage began. Not revenge, not punishment, resolution. There's a final stage in every long unraveling. It doesn't feel like victory. It doesn't feel like defeat either. It feels like closure taking shape. By the time the case reached its final phase, nothing about Richard's world looked the same anymore. Not because it collapsed overnight, but because it had been carefully, legally, and quietly exposed piece by piece. And systems don't survive exposure. They survive secrecy. That was the difference now. Where the court filings were no longer theoretical. They were active, structured, and verified. Every financial layer that had once been hidden was now accounted for. Every movement documented. Every assumption tested. Richard sat through most of it in silence. Not resistance, not defense, just stillness. The kind that comes when fighting no longer changes outcomes. Meanwhile, I didn't arrive as someone trying to win. I arrived as someone whose position had already been established long before the hearing began. Martin handled everything with precision. No emotion, no exaggeration. Just structure meeting structure. And that's what made it undeniable. The court wasn't watching a conflict anymore. It was reviewing a system. At one point, Richard looked over at me, not angry, not pleading, just unfamiliar. As if he was trying to locate the version of me he remembered and realizing she was no longer present in the room because she wasn't, not in the way he understood. The proceedings continued, but something had already changed. The narrative was no longer his to shape. It wasn't mine either. It belonged to what had been documented. And documentation doesn't argue. It simply exists. When the final determinations were outlined, there was no dramatic moment, no outburst, no collapse, just resolution, structured, formal, final. Richard remained seated longer than necessary afterward, as if waiting for something else to happen, something that would reverse it, or soften it, or return control. But nothing came, because nothing needed to. Outside the courtroom, the air felt different. Not lighter, not heavier, just finished. Richard stopped beside the car for a moment, then spoke quietly. I didn't think it would go this way. I looked at him, not with anger, not with satisfaction, with clarity. I know, I said. A pause, longer this time. Then I added something simple, something final. But you assumed I would remain the version of myself you stopped paying attention to. Silence. He didn't respond, because there was nothing left to correct. And that was the truth of it. Not revenge, not punishment, just consequence meeting preparation. Later that evening, alone, I sat by the window. No phone calls, no documents, no strategy, just stillness. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't reviewing what had been taken from me or what I had uncovered. I was simply aware of what remained. Not anger, not regret, not even relief. Understanding. One, because what had happened wasn't about destruction, it was about revelation. The revelation that silence is not weakness, that observation is not passivity, and that preparation often looks invisible until it is complete. Richard thought divorce would break me, but he mistook quiet for surrender. And that was the only real mistake. Because I didn't need to become someone new. I simply needed to stop pretending I was less than I was. And once that stopped, nothing could undo it. The affair wasn't the betrayal. The lies weren't even the betrayal. The betrayal was believing I wouldn't fight back. And the best part, he was wrong about that too. Richard is fine. His money is smaller. His life is lonelier. And Claire, she sent me a friend request last week. I haven't accepted it yet. Maybe I will. Maybe I won't. Ma, that's the thing about being untouchable. You get to decide. My name is Elaine Harper. I am 48 years old. I was a wife for 17 years. And now? Now I am something else entirely. I am the woman who stopped pretending. And that woman, I have learned, is untouchable.